Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. And today for forest management, we're going to be talking about harvesting trees, or at least the cutting method of harvesting trees. Now, as we progress through forest management, there are some things that have clearly changed when we talk about management. And part of management is utilizing a resource. So even though I might talk about the ecology of a forest, the role of wildlife in forests, the ecosystem, how to maintain a healthy forest, um, it all is going to come back to this is also a natural resource. This is also a resource in which forest will be harvested. Right? If you're a manager, you're going to harvest some trees somewhere in the forest that you're managing. You're going to take trees. Now, there are quite a few methods to do this. Most of the time, as a forest manager, you're not going to necessarily be the individual cutting the trees. Um, you're going to hire a professional to do that. But I'm going to go over some of the equipment, some of the tips, just because a lot of people who are in forest management or deal with trees, um, instead of paying someone, a professional, to come and cut a tree out of your yard, you're going to cut it yourself. And I just want to provide some of the tips and some of the terminology around cutting trees, um, just so you have kind of a better idea of what's talked about, especially if you're reading a book like The Final Forest. Okay, they talk a lot about different equipment cuts, those kind of things in The Final Forest, and this kind of give you an idea of what they're talking about a little bit more. Okay, of course, I am not suggesting that you cut a tree down with a two-man saw or hand saw. I guess you can, um, but these are difficult pieces of equipment to use. Modern technology has made it much easier, much quicker to cut down a tree. But we're going to talk about two types of cuttings, and the first type of cutting is chainsaw cut or an individual cut. Okay, so when we talk about types of cutting, um, we can talk about the individual, which is mostly done by chainsaw. And yes, some countries are doing it by handsaw. In some parts of the world, they're still doing it by axe. Regardless of the equipment you use, it's still a personal cut. Maybe it's a team cut, depending on the size of the tree, but it's still done by individuals with the aid of some machinery. Okay, a chainsaw is a machine, um, but it's still individually ran piece of equipment. Okay, and it's not as invasive on the environment as, say, a machine cut. Okay, the other piece of equipment shown here is a Ponzi cutter. Now there are lots of different types, lots of different brands, different configurations. But Ponzi cutters are kind of a novel piece of equipment that has really changed forest management and changed the harvesting of trees. I don't know if it's for the better. I would argue that this piece of equipment alone, you can run a single person in this piece of equipment. This piece of equipment has probably replaced, for one piece of equipment like this, you probably replace 5 loggers. So you get one piece of equipment, 5 loggers are gone. That's how beneficial, how quick this piece of equipment is. If you have never watched one of these, I highly suggest that you like Google Ponce harvesters, watch a video on how quick and efficient these pieces of equipment can be. Now, that being said, it's like any large piece of equipment. If it gets stuck or if it doesn't work, it could set you back, a large amount of time. Where if your chainsaw doesn't work, you just get your second chainsaw. Okay, most loggers carry two. So you know there is an aspect of, you know, the more machine heavy your equipment has to be, the more of a handyman or ability to fix the equipment you have to have. But the way a Ponce cutter harvester works, you have these clamps. The clamps get opened and grabbed onto the tree. You have a cutting chain or a cutting blade at the bottom, and often you'll have a cutting blade at the top too. It depends. Obviously, it depends on the harvester. But anyways, you cut the bottom of the tree. You lean it forward. You can, dictate where it falls. Okay, and then you have these wheels, these spiked wheels that run the side of the tree, and you can run this whole thing along the side of the tree or around the tree, and that will delimb the tree. There's also a guide in there. Often it's a laser guide or a wheel guide that tells you the distance. So you can start, you cut it, okay, lean it down, run these wheels down it, delimit for a certain distance. How long that is, cut it there. That's going to fit your truck or whatever it might be that you're going to use that tree with. And then run it down more, cut it that known distance. Okay, so maybe you're cutting it every 18 feet, every 20 feet. Okay, and that's just how efficient these work. Literally, a guy that's operating this is just using kind of a joystick. They can harvest a tree in less than a minute. And a logger, there's no way you can harvest a tree that fast. Even if you're excellent, yes, the cut might not take you very long, but delimbing and cutting the tree into, a consistent length, it's going to take you longer as an individual. Okay, so I'm not going to show you how to work a Ponce harvester because I don't own one and I've never worked one. But if I can find a crew that's working where I'm at and using a Ponce harvester, I will definitely get some video of it. Otherwise, you can just Google it and you can see these in action. I am, however, going to show you how I personally would cut a tree down, how I cut a tree down using the technique that's been taught to me. My father was part of the tree crew for the national park for 20 years. I also worked as a choker setter when I was younger. So I've worked around logging communities quite a bit. And I've seen different ways, different methods to cut trees down. And I'll talk about some different methods and different ways. And there's lots of ways, and each logger is going to have their personal favorite. And that's completely fine. All of them have kind of a general premise, though. You have a face side of the tree. Okay, the face side of the tree is the side of the tree that's going to hit the ground first or is facing the direction you want the tree to go. Okay? If it's a straight tree, then you can pick really any side of the tree to make it face. Just depends on what direction you want the tree to fall. That's the face side. If it's a leaning tree and you're not going to pole it, you're not going to cable it up or anything like that, most of the time, whatever direction it's leaning, that's going to be the face side of the tree. Now, obviously, you can cable these. If you're going to cable the tree and pull it the opposite direction that it's leaning, for just kind of a rule of thumb, if you're going to do this personally and on your own trees at your own home, I don't suggest this. It's a very technical cut. I suggest hiring someone that knows what they're doing. But if you're going to do it as a rule of thumb, you need to cable into the top 1/3 of the tree. Okay, so that's where you're going to rope up or cable up, is that top 1/3, and you're going to have to hook that in to a pulley system, a come along system, a vehicle, something to kind of pull tension onto that tree to drive it back against the lean. Again, I suggest that you have a professional do this. Okay. Now, for simple cuts where it's leaning in the direction you want it to fall, or it's a tree in the middle of nowhere, and it doesn't really matter which direction you drop it. Okay, that face side is the side that you want, the direction that you want it to go. Okay. Your first cut is going to be what's called a notch cut. Okay, your notch cut. Lots of different loggers have lots of different methods for notch cutting. Okay, this diagram is showing that you have a notch cut on the top and a different angled notch cut on the bottom. Okay, I prefer to not use a technique like this. I instead use a notch cut on the top and a straight cut for my bottom cut to cut a notch out. Again, this is purely preference of the individual who's cutting the tree. But that notch cut is extremely important. Okay? That notch cut is going to be what hinges your tree to fall in a certain direction. Okay? So your notch cut needs to go on the face side of your tree. It should be the first cut you make. Most loggers will make the top notch cut and then some kind of bottom notch cut. And that might be an angle or that might be a straight. Again, up to the logger. Now, as far as how deep you're going, okay, this again is preference of the logger. You need to go at least 1/5. I would not go less than 1/5. Some people like to go 1/4, so they like to go a little deeper. Okay, I suppose there's a few people that might even go 1/3 of the tree width. Okay, but nonetheless, you don't want to go too deep. If you go too deep, you can cause that back cut to be weak, the hinge to be weak, and the tree might fall the opposite direction that you want it to go. Okay. Now, your last cut is what's called the felling cut, or what's called the back cut. Okay. Now, you're not going to cut all the way through. Okay, you're going to leave a hinge. Okay, so you're going to leave a little chunk of wood, and your felling cut should be, and this one shows a little bit of an angle. Okay, it's kind of a little bit of an angle going down. I like a little more angle on my felling cut. It's just my preference. Okay, on a big tree, okay, your felling cut should be started once you get the saw in far enough that you can drive a wedge in behind. This will keep the tree from pinching down on your saw blade, and so you'll drive a wedge in. Okay, it also keeps the tree from falling back the opposite direction. but you can drive a wedge in, okay, and that will tip the tree this direction. You'll see in the video, I'm going to show you safety equipment that you should use if you're going to fall trees. And I'm going to show you the method I like to use to cut down trees in the video. Okay, so when limbing the tree, and you'll see this in the video, I'm just not sure that it comes out all that well in the video. There are two different types of cuts when you're limbing a tree, and one is called a pulling chain or a pulling cut, and that is when you're going down with the chainsaw. And the other one is called a pushing cut or a pushing chain, and that's when you're coming up with the chainsaw. Now, because of the tension on branches, and because when you're debranching a tree that is down, you'll have branches that are holding the weight of that tree. Okay, so sometimes it's necessary to use a pulling and pushing cut on that branch. You just want to offset them. You don't want to cut them at the exact same spot. Otherwise, it'll pinch your saw blade. So you might use a pulling cut and then use a pushing cut a little bit to, the left of it or the right of it, and that will cause the branch, to snap, break, release the tension, and it won't pinch your saw blade. Hopefully that's clear in the video, or some of you guys can get that from the video. But next up, you'll see me explaining safety equipment, cut a tree down, and do some limbing of the tree. That's normally what it's called when you remove branches. And both using the pulling cut and the pushing cut. Okay.
Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, and today I'm going to show you the proper way to cut a tree down. We're going to talk a little bit about the method and some of the techniques to cut trees down. There are lots of techniques out there. There are lots of methods out there. I'm just going to show you the ones that I think are the safest and most useful. Now, some loggers, some people who do this for a living, or some people who just have done it a lot, they might not agree with the technique that I'm going to show you today. But regardless, I'm going to show you some of the equipment that's used, and then I'm going to cut a tree down and show you kind of how that tree, how you can direct the tree to fall in the direction that you're interested in, even when it's kind of windy. So it's kind of windy today, so we're gonna give that a shot. Okay, so first of all, this is a tree that I'm gonna cut down. Okay, this is a juniper. Okay, so hopefully you can see that it's not a very tall tree. It's just in the way of my new garden beds, and so I'm gonna cut it down. I want the tree to fall in this direction, so I want it to fall towards the ditch over there, not towards the fence. The wind is kind of blowing from kind of a southwest direction, so that could push the tree into the fence or into my beds, and the tree is kind of leaning a little bit back towards the fence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cut on this side of the tree. This is called the face of the tree. So the face of the tree is the side that you want to, basically the direction that you want the tree to fall. Okay, so this side here is going to be the face of the tree, and I'm going to make what's called a wedge cut. A wedge cut is my first cut is going to be a wedge cut, but the first cut is going to be a downward cut. Okay, and it's going to be cut at an angle, and I'm going to cut in about 1/3 of the tree, okay? And then I'm gonna cut a horizontal cut that comes in and makes a wedge out of the tree. Now I'll show you that technique. You'll see, I'm gonna place you down while I'm running that saw, and I'll show that technique, okay? So that's going to make the initial kind of wedge out of the tree. And then the other side of the tree, this side over here, is the side away from the face, is called the back side. And then I'm going to do a back cut. Okay, I like to do a back cut at just a little bit of an angle. That way I don't have to do a bore cut. Okay, so a bore cut would mean that off of your wedge, you're gonna move off your wedge a little bit, and you're gonna plunge the saw into the tree and cut away, okay, from the tree. Now you would use a bore cut on a really large tree. If I did it on this tree, it'd be basically meaningless because the width of the saw blade is big enough that it would cut right through the tree and drop the tree anyways. So anyhow, I'm going to do a back cut. That'll be my 3rd cut and final cut, and the tree should fall in that direction towards the ditch, okay? If everything goes right. Now, before we get all that cutting done and situated, I want to talk a little bit about gear. Okay, so right now you can see that I'm wearing chaps. Okay, these are logger chaps that, you know, protect you. They're I don't want to say they're chainsaw proof, but if the chainsaw was to slip and hit my leg, it wouldn't end my day. It wouldn't put me in the hospital, and it would scare me, probably, or scare anybody if that's the case. But it's not the end of your career as a walking individual, okay? Chainsaws are a very dangerous piece of equipment if you're not using them correctly. Okay, I also have steel-toed boots on. That's a really good thing that most people wear when they're doing logging work. I'll also use a face shield, a helmet, and ear protection. Okay, it's all built in one. It's kind of a nice little deal. I wear gloves just because I don't like splinters and things like that. But nonetheless, that's kind of the situation. So when I come back, the camera will be set up. I'm going to make that initial wedge cut, okay, and then I'll make a back cut, and we'll drop this tree, and that'll be how, you know, how you cut a tree down properly, okay, when we come back. Okay guys, I'm back. Gonna put some safety gear on real quick. I'm gonna cut this tree down. Now, a couple things with chainsaws in general. Most chainsaws, they have a line on the top of the chainsaw, or the handle is at least straight. That's used for your initial cut. That wedge cut on the face side, that's used for you to tell what direction that tree is going to fall. So if I'm cutting the tree on this side, okay, you can see this line is showing me the direction that that tree is going to fall. Okay, that's it's kind of a useful piece of information there. The other thing that I see a lot of people when they're using a chainsaw, they don't actually know that a chainsaw should not be kicking out sawdust. Okay, a chainsaw, if it's sharp, should be kicking out a more coarse material. Okay, so it should be kicking out what you would basically saw shavings is what it's called. Okay, not sawdust. If your chainsaw is kicking out sawdust, it means you need to sharpen your chainsaw. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna fire this up. You're probably not gonna be able to hear much except for a chainsaw. I'm gonna do a wedge cut, and then I'll do a back cut, and we'll drop that tree in that ditch. Okay. So you can see there that the wind's blowing it back. So if the wind's blowing it back, you need to put a wedge in and wedge it in so that the tree will go this way. And that's why a lot of people, if they're going to cut in windy weather, they make sure they carry wedges with them, because that tree will be tipping back. And so, especially on big trees, you'll want to wedge in the back while your saw is still running inside the tree, and then do the remainder cut. Okay, now when cutting the rest of this, okay, so I fell in the ditch right where I wanted to fall it. I didn't go back onto the fence. Okay, I didn't go into my garden. Okay, and that's the key with making that wedge cut at the first and then doing the back cut. That wedge cut is the direction cut. Okay, that's going to ensure that you're following it in a certain direction. Now, in some cases, a wedge cut's just not enough. If you have a tree leaning, okay, so let's go over here for a little bit. If you have a tree like this one, okay, you can see this here, this pine tree, ponderosa pine, it's leaning this way. If I'm going to try to fall this uphill, okay, and I want it to go this way, and let's say I have a house here, okay, and I don't want this to fall on the house, it doesn't matter how good you are at cutting a wedge, you're never going to get this tree to go against gravity. Okay, so what you would need to do is, you can still do it, you can make a wedge cut, but then you need to go up to at least the top 1/3 of the tree, hook a cable to it, hook a good rope to it, and then pull it back the direction that you want it to go. So a lot of loggers or tree cutters who are working in regions that, you know, might have you know, they might have a lot of houses or picnic tables or shelters or things like that. They're very good at using cable work and winches and things like that, so that you can take those trees that are leaning over buildings and you can drag them back to where you want it to be. Okay, the final piece that I want to talk about is two types of cuts that you cut when you use that when you're cutting up branches and things like that. So there are two types of cuts. One's called a pole cut, and a pole cut is a cut from the top of the branch. So you'll see when I'm gonna limb this branch here, or limb this tree a little bit, just so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. The pole cut comes from the top, and then a push cut comes from the bottom. Now, different branches, different technique. Sometimes you want to use a push cut, okay, to start, and maybe you'll go halfway through the branch, especially if it's load bearing, if it's, you know, one of these branches that are down here on the ground that's, you know, holding this tree up. Okay, you'll want to use a push cut from the bottom, and then a pole cut off center. You don't want to put them right on each other. Off center just a little bit. You'll use a push cut from, or sorry, you'll use a pole cut from, a push cut from the bottom, okay, and then a pole cut from the top, but you want them off centered from each other to ensure that the branch doesn't bind your blade or bind your chain. Okay, so sometimes they're called cuts, so pole cut, push cut. Sometimes they're called pole chain, push chain. So it just depends on the terminology, but a pole chain is going from the top and a push chain is going from the bottom. Okay, so you're going to see that here when I come back, put safety gear on, start you back up. You're going to see me use both techniques real quick, like to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm back. I'm going to put some safety gear on and then just do a pull chain and a push chain on this tree. Some of that. Nonetheless, okay, that's some of the proper ways to cut a tree down. Again, you're going to use a wedge cut on the face side, and you're going to use a back cut on the back side to drop the tree in the direction that you want. Now, some professionals like to cut trees very low when they do a wedge cut. Okay, most loggers like to do it very low when they're doing a wedge cut. On the other hand, individuals like homeowners, when you do a wedge cut and a back cut, I highly suggest leaving the stump high enough that if you're going to remove the stump, that you can get a chain around this stump. You can start digging it out, you can get a chain around it, and then you can pull it out with, you know, a truck or something like that. That's, you know, an easy way to remove it. If you cut it really low, then getting a chain or getting any material, you know, around the stump, it's really difficult to get that around the stump and get it pulled out. Loggers, they like to use as much wood as possible, so you cut it as low as possible so you can get more board foot or cubic volume out of the tree of interest. Okay. The cutting video, I mentioned in the cutting video that a chainsaw that's kicking out sawdust is not sharp and needs sharpened, that it should be kicking out more like shavings. And just to kind of show you what I'm talking about, this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a saw that's sharp. It's kicking out chunks of wood, okay, not sawdust. Okay, if a saw is kicking out sawdust, then that individual needs to sharpen their saw. It's just kind of a technique thing that I like to share with students, so you can understand when you're reading information about what is a wedge. Okay, again, a wedge is, you know, something that's typically put in on the back side of a cut to hold the opening on the back side, to hold it open so the saw blade doesn't get stuck, but also to kind of rock that tree forward. You could see in the video when I just pushed the tree over. I don't suggest doing that, but I knew that this tree, it's a really small tree, and I knew that it was going that direction anyways. I was just fighting kind of a wind that was blowing it back towards me. But most people, again, will carry wedges. I highly suggest wedging the tree. Bring a hammer, wedge it in there. If I would have brought a hammer, wedged it in there, I wouldn't have had to touch the tree to push it over, but regardless, it is what it is. Okay, so wedges, another piece of equipment that I didn't show you, but you know, everyone who owns a chainsaw should use. That's a multi-tool. Okay, this has got, you know, basically a socket for the nuts on the side, so you can adjust the saw bar. It's also got a screwdriver, so eventually what happens is your chain will heat up and the links, it warms up the links, it gets really hot, and this chain stretches. So your chain stretches over time with use, and so as the chain stretches over time with use, you need to tighten that chain on the bar. To do that, there is a little screw right down here. Okay, most of the time it's on the inside between the bar and the rakers, but sometimes it's on the outside. Okay, but nonetheless, you just tighten that chain using the screwdriver. You'll often have to loosen the bar a little bit to do that, but you'll loosen the bar a little bit, tighten the chain, and then tighten the bar. Over time, if given enough time, that chain may stretch so much that it no longer fits your bar. At that time, okay, if you're a cheap person, or if the chain has a lot of life left in it. So here you can see this is a tooth of a chain, okay, and so if it has a lot of life left in it and they're not really short, you can see a little line on that chain. Okay, if it gets to that point, that chain's pretty much done. Okay, but it also tells you the angle at which the tooth should be sharpened at. But if your chain tooth is way back there, then it's time to get a new chain. But a lot of people, unfortunately, who don't know much about chains and chainsaws, they will buy a chainsaw for home use. They'll use it, and they'll use it often. Maybe they'll cut wood for their fireplace, etc. And then once that chain doesn't fit, they think, well, it's done, right? But that's not the case. You can separate these links, and you can remove a link, and or you can remove, a couple links. And if you still got a lot of teeth, a lot of life left on the teeth of the chain, you can shorten your chain. That way, extending the life of that chain